Psikolohiyang Pilipino. It is an indigenous psychology. Indigenous means originating from a particular place, and psychology, a study of human mind. Psikolohiyang Pilipino is anchored on Filipino thought and experience is understood from a Filipino perspective. The most important aspect of this definition is the Filipino orientation. Ito yung pag-aaral ng mga ideas, culture or cultural orientation at yung mga karasan ng mga Pilipino. So basically, we're trying to see in the lens of our culture as a Filipino because not at all chances our behavior as Filipino can be tested or described by the Western lenses. We have this Filipino psychology for us to understand using our own language and our own native lens. Indigenization from within is the goal of Psikolohiyang Pilipino. Enriquez, referred by many as the father of Filipino psychology, defined Psikolohiyang Pilipino as the study of diwa, which in Filipino directly refers to the wealth of ideas referred to by the philosophical concept of essence and an entire range of psychological concepts from awareness to motives to behavior. Diwa is a Tagalog term for psyche or pag-iisip. Again, Psikolohiyang Pilipino refers to an indigenization from within. So we base our own or gamit natin ang sarili nating kultura. We use the culture of our native ancestors, the language in making assessments. It also helps in understanding the local language. So, ano ang ibig sabihin ng diwa? We have terms that are important to know such as kapwa, diwa, saya, ligaya, and many more terms. Psikolohiyang Pilipino also focuses on the personality characteristics and traits of us Filipinos, so explaining them through the eyes of native Filipino. That's why Psikolohiyang Pilipino was established, because as I had said, not at all chances, Freud and Adler can explain Filipino personalities. So moving forward, the principal emphasis of Psikolohiyang Pilipino is to foster national identity, consciousness, social involvement, and psychology of language and culture. So Psikolohiyang Pilipino uses proper application to health, art, mass media, religion, and other spheres of people's daily lives. Pang-araw-araw din po siyang na-apply in all aspect of every Filipino. Much of the strategy for discovering Psikolohiyang Pilipino is in revealing Filipino characteristics and explaining them through the eyes of native Filipino. It is based on assessing historical and socio-cultural realities and understanding local languages. This resulted in a body of knowledge which includes indigenous concepts and methods. In short, a psychology which is appropriate and significant to Filipino. So with this indigenous concept, we have superstitious beliefs o yung mga pamahiin. It is important that we know this superstitious belief, yung mga bawal sa hindi. Ito yung mga kasabihan ng matatanda na applicable sa culture natin at naging parte na rin ng ating kamalayan. Some of the examples are bawal magupit ng kuko kapag gabi, bawal magwalis ng gabi dahil nga parang nilalabas mo yung grasya or swerte. Bawal rin magligpit ng pinggan pag may kumakain pa. We also have the superstitious belief that you assure your host that you're human. So yung tao po, that is very applicable to our culture when we're trying to knock the door. And we also have this belief that we respect the elemental. Meron tayong tabi-tabi po kung dadaan ka sa mga gilid-gilid para hindi tayo makulam or kung sa Bisaya pa mabuyagan. So we have that existing terms, barang, kulam, that also Now let's talk about Enriquez, the father of Filipino psychology. A pioneer of Psikolohiyang Pilipino born in the province of Bulacan, Philippines. So Virgilio Gaspar Enriquez was trained by his father to speak the native tongue fluently since he was a child. So, nung bata pa siya, lagi siyang tinitrain ng father niya to use his mother tongue, which is Tagalog. Like for example, bibigyan siya ng English newspaper ng father niya, and then he will read it in Tagalog. He'll read it out loud as if it was written in Tagalog. So that's how his father trained him as a kid. So Enriquez was formally initiated into psychology in 1963 when he started teaching at University of the Philippines. So as early as 1965, he was using the Filipino language in teaching. So Enriquez was critical of this approach to the study of Filipino values. He encouraged Filipino scholars to take a second look at these values using a Filipino orientation. So now let us examine these Filipino values from exogenous and indigenous perspective. First, we have bahala na. So bahala na, the Filipino cultural value of bahala na has no exact English translation. The Psikolohiya in Filipino perspective interprets bahala na indifferently. So, Lagmay 1977 explained that bahala na is not a fatalism, but determination and risk-taking. When we Filipinos utter the expression, bahala na, they are not leaving their fate to God and remaining passive. Rather, they are telling themselves that they are ready to face the difficult situation before them, and they will do their best to achieve their objectives. So I know most of the time we use this expression, bahala na, yun na yun. Parang that's how we end it. That's how we end things. So, bahala na belongs to confrontative surface value. And later on, a co-reporter of mine will going to tackle further about that. Now, let's move to hiya. Sibley 1965, an American scholar, translated hiya as shame. So, hiya, it can either be a positive or negative depending on the action. Let's say, for example, you were scolded in front of many people. Kung ikaw yung napahiya, syempre you'll feel uncomfortable kasi napahiya ka sa maraming tao. So, that's the negative side of hiya. Well, meron din namang mahiyaing tao or shy, and it's not a bad thing that mahiyain ka. So, hiya has a lot of forms and it can vary depending on the situation. Next one, we have utang na loob. So, utang na loob was translated by Kaut as debt of gratitude. So, kapag tinulungan ka ng isang tao, you will also return the favor kung sila naman yung nangangailangan. It is not actually an obligatory act, but then, nasa sayo na yun. And knowing us Filipinos, we really give back what is given to us. And I think that it is one of the positive traits of us Filipinos. And for the last one, we have pakikisama versus pakikipagkapwa. So, pakikisama was identified by Lynch 1961-1973 as a Filipino value, giving it the English translation of maintaining smooth interpersonal relations by going along with the group or the majority decision. Kung nakikisama ka sa mga taong nakapaligid sa'yo, sa pamilya mo, sa mga kaibigan mo, sa mga taong kakilala mo. So you make the same decisions and you agree with each other. So that's the bond of pakikisama. And that bond will make your relationship tighten and more stronger. Pakikipagkapwa means treating the other person as kapwa or fellow human being. So, from the word kapwa, the heart of structure of Filipino values. So, at this juncture, my co-reporter will present to you the categories of kapwa.
Two categories of wika. da ibang tao or outsider, pagsasarili, individuation, pag-iwas, avoidance, paghiwalay, separation, pagmamalaki, autonomy, pakikinabang, personal gain, da hindi ibang tao, pagkukubli or mask, pagwawalang bahala, lack of concern, pagsalungat, disagree. So we have here the indirect communication. Is another aspect of Filipino personality that was given attention by the Psikolohiyang Pilipino perspective is the propensity for indirect communication. Pakikiramdam is a request to feel or to be sensitive to. It is a shared feeling, a kind of emotional a prior. In other words, it is a feeling for another, exercising great care and deliberation. So, pakikiramdam ay mahalaga sa aspekto ng kapwa. So, this means pagkakaroon ng pag-unawa at pagiging sensitibo sa kalagayan ng iba. So, with the help of pakikiramdam, maaari nating maiwasan ang kahihiyan sa isang sitwasyon. So, second, the internality and externality. So, the Filipino language has two words for the English word honor, puri indangal. Puri refers to honor which is physical, such as that bestowed through compliments or applauses for a good performance. Thus external, it can also refer to virginity which is a virtue expected of unmarried Filipino woman. Dangal is honor from within knowledge of one's true worth, character, achievement, and success. So, honor is to regard or treat someone with admiration and respect or paggalang sa isang tao. And dangal, so yes, dignity or ang ating dignidad bilang tao. So, last is the Great Culture Divide. Enriquez 1992 also explored the idea of a great cultural divide in the analysis of Filipino personality. On one side of the cultural divide are Filipinos who have maintained a more mass-oriented worldview, culture, and way of life. So this means they are concerned with their culture. Behavioral patterns and value structure. Surface, societal, and core values. So sa surface, accommodation, surface value, hiya, the dignity, utang na loob, gratitude or solidarity or norm of reciprocity. Pakikisama or companionship, esteem, associated behavioral patterns, biro or joke, lambing, sweetness, tampo, affective disappointment, confrontative surface value, bahala na, determination, lakas ng loob, guts, pakikibaka, cooperative resistance. So sa core, pivotal interpersonal value, pakikiramdam, pakikipagkapwa-tao, shared inner perception, core value, kapwa, or shared identity, linking social personal values, kagandahang loob, pagkamakatao, shared humanity, associated societal values, karangalan or dignity, katarungan or justice, kalayaan, freedom.
So next is about true versus false selves. The first person we have is Sigmund Freud. According to him, it distorts reality to keep the unconscious from entering the conscious. He said that the self consists of the conscious, the unconscious, and the preconscious. The conscious self is based on reality principle, on what one actually does. The unconscious contains the way one acts due to his or her instincts and intuitions. The preconscious is neither of the two, but in between, it won't become a problem and is effortlessly thinkable. The next one is horny. Horny says that it is to maintain idealized self-concept. An example of this is compartmentalization. And for those who do not know yet what is compartmentalization, it is to separate something into sections or categories. The next one is Adler. He believed that it is about safeguarding tendencies. Some of the examples are aggression, excuse, and withdrawal. In other words, it allows people to hide their personal attitude to others and in order to maintain their current lifestyle. The next one is Fromm. For him, it is authoritarian, destructiveness, and conformity. Fromm believed that mankind could develop a psychologically balanced, sane society. The next one is Sullivan. According to him, it is about security operations, dissociation, and selective inattention. According to him, personality can never be isolated from the complex interpersonal relationships in which a person lives. Security operations are measures that the individual engages to reduce anxiety and enhance security. The next one is Rogers. He views it as incongruence, distortion, and denial. He developed a humanistic psychology concept which implies that unpleasant feelings can result from a distinction between our perceived and ideal selves. The next one we have is Skinner, and he views it as reinforced defense. According to him, if the consequences to an action are bad, there is a high chance the action will not be repeated. If the consequences are good, the probability of the action being repeated becomes stronger. The last example we have is evolutionary. It exists because of its evolutionary benefit. It proposes that the human brain comprises many functional mechanisms called psychological adaptations or evolved cognitive mechanisms designed by the process of natural selection. Now let's proceed to the next discussion. The self is proactive and agentic. Number 1, we have Bandura's social cognitive theory. Number 2, we have Kelly's psychology of personal constructs. First, let's talk about Bandura's cognitive theory. On figure 15a, Bandura's triadic reciprocal causation, we have the reciprocal determinism. This concept shows how the environment, which is the stimuli from social or physical environment and the reinforcement contingencies, affect a person and his or her personality characteristics, their cognitive processes, and self-regulation skills, which then will affect behavior and its nature, frequency, and its intensity. Then it will later have an effect on environment, so on and so forth. Now let's move on to figure 15b, which is Bandura's concept of self-efficacy. We'll start by defining self-efficacy. So what is self-efficacy? Self-efficacy is when we have a high degree of belief in our abilities to do certain things. There are 4 ways to develop self-efficacy. First, we have the performance outcomes. It is the feeling of high self-efficacy based upon having prior successful experiences. The second one is vicarious experiences. It is a kind of situation in which levels of self-efficacy are either increased or reduced as a result of observing another person or group's performance. Then we have verbal persuasion. It is increased or decreased feeling of self-efficacy centered around positive or negative feedback related to task performance. And the last one we have is psychological feedback. It is the feeling of positive or negative self-efficacy linked to the signals that one's body is sending related to performance. So there we have it. That, everyone, is how self-efficacy is developed. Now, let's move on to Bandura's concept of self-regulation. We have the self-observation, judgmental process, and self-reaction. Self-observation means monitoring our performance. It is an awareness practice where you turn your attention inward and non-judgmentally watch what you think, feel, and do. The judgmental process is the self-evaluation based on personal standards, standards of preference, value of activity, and performance attribution. And the last, which is the self-reaction, where we must create incentives for our own actions through self-reinforcement or self-punishment.
Our next topic is the personal construct theory of George Kelly. After World War II, Kelly became a professor of psychology at Ohio State University, where he worked for almost 20 years. It was here that he formally developed his personal construct theory. He published two texts called The Psychology of Personal Constructs, Volume 1 and 2, which summarized the majority of his theory. Kelly's personal construct theory suggested that the difference between people result from the different way that we predict and interpret events in the world around us. For the key points about the personal construct theory is the following. Number 1, individuals anticipate events by the meaning or interpretation they place on those events, called constructs. Second, behavior is shaped by interpretation or construction of the world. Third, every construction is open to revision or replacement. And number 4, people are not victims of circumstances because they are capable of changing their interpretation of events, or commonly called the constructive alternativism. So what is Kelly's definition of the term construct? Kelly believed that we start by first developing a set of personal constructs, which are essentially mental representation that we use to interpret events. These constructs are based on our experience and observations. And here is the following of Kelly's construct that he presented. So first is the core constructs. Important beliefs that are part of the individual's person identity. Second is the loose constructs. These refer to beliefs that are unstable, weak, and poorly defined. This lead to erratic and often invalid prediction about how the world operates. Number 3, peripheral constructs. These are beliefs that are relatively unimportant to the person and that can be changed rather easily. Number 4 is the preemptive constructs. This includes only its own elements and maintains that these elements cannot apply to other constructs. Number 5, propositional constructs. These leave all their elements open for modification. And lastly, number 6, constellatory constructs. These allow their elements to belong to other constructs concurrently. And now we will proceed to the Kelly's 11 corollaries. So number 1 is the construction corollary. It was to anticipate future events according to their interpretation of recurrent themes. So construction corollary focuses on similarities among repeated events. For Kelly, he believed no life event or experience could be reproduced exactly as it occurred the first time. An event can be repeated, but it will not be experienced in precisely the same way. For example, if if you watch a movie today that you first saw last month, your experience of it will be different the second time. Your mood may not be the same, and during the elapsed month, you were exposed to events that affected your attitude and emotions. And that's it. So for the number 2, or the individuality corollary, so people have different experiences, therefore construe events in different ways. So individuality corollary focuses on individual differences in interpreting events. With this corollary, Kelly introduced the notion of individual differences. He pointed out that people differ from one another in how they perceive or interpret an event, and because people construe events differently, they thus form different construct. And that was for the individuality corollary. So the third one is the organization corollary. So it is how to organize their personal constructs in a hierarchical system. So organizational corollary focuses on relationship among constructs. As we organize individual constructs into pattern according to our view of their interrelationship, their similarities and differences, a construct can include one or more subordinate constructs. So that's it. Next is the number 4, or the dichotomy, where people construe events in an either or manner. So dichotomy corollary focuses on two mutually exclusive alternatives. All constructs are bipolar or dichotomous. This is necessary if we are to anticipate future events correctly. Just as we note similarities among people or events, we must also account for the similarities. Example: it is not enough to have a construct about a friend that describes the personal characteristic of honesty. We must also consider the opposite, which is the dishonesty, to explain how the honest person differs from someone who is honest. So that was for the dichotomy. So the next is the number 5, which is the choice corollary, where people choose the alternatives that they see as extending the range of future choices. So choice corollary focuses on freedom of choice. The notion that people have freedom of choice is found throughout Kelly's writings. For every situation, we must choose the alternative that works best for us, the one that allows us to anticipate or predict the outcome of future events. So as an example, suppose you must decide which of 2 courses to take the next semester. So that's for choice corollary. Next is the range, or the range corollary. A construct are limited to a particular range of convenience, not relevant to all situations. So range corollary precisely means that few personal constructs are appropriate or relevant for all situations. One example of this is consider the construct tall versus short, which obviously has a limited range of convenience or applicability. It can be useful with respect to buildings, trees, or basketball players, but is of no value in describing a pizza or the weather. And that was for the range corollary. Next is the experience corollary, where people continually revise their construct as the result of experience. So, experience corollary mainly focuses on similarities among repeated events. Kelly believed no life event or experience could be reproduced exactly as it occurred the first time. An event can be repeated, but it will not be experienced in precisely the same way. So, as an example, each construct is a hypothesis generated on the basis of past experience to predict or anticipate future events. Each construct is then tested against reality by determining how well it predicted a given event. So that was for the experience corollary. So next is the modulation, or the modulation corollary, where some new experiences do not lead to a revision of contracts because these are concrete or impermeable. So modulation corollary mainly focuses on adapting to new experiences. Constructs differ in their permeability to permit means to penetrate or pass through something. A As an example, a bigot person applies to construct high versus low intelligence in a fixed or impermeable way to people of a certain ethnic minority group. Believing that all members of this group have low intelligence, the new experience will not penetrate or alter this belief. And that was for the modulation. The number 9 is the fragmentation corollary, where people behavior is sometimes inconsistent because their construct system can readily admit incompatible elements. So, fragmentation corollary mainly focuses on competition among constructs. Kelly believed that within our construct system, some construct might be incompatible even though they coexist within the overall pattern. As an example for this, a man meets a woman in a psychology class and decides that he is attracted to her. She is also a psychology major and her interests seem similar to his. She fits the friend alternative of the construct friend versus enemy. So that's for the fragmentation. Number 10 is the commonality corollary, where personal constructs of people with similar experiences tend to be similar. So, commonality corollary mainly focuses on similarities among people in interpreting events. Because people differ in the way they construe events, each person develops unique constructs. However, people also show similarities in the ways of construing events. An example for this is people from the same culture may show a resemblance in their behaviors and characteristics even though they are exposed to different life events. So that's for commonality. So for the last one is the sociality corollary, where people can communicate with others because they are able to construe others' constructions. So the sociality corollary, it focuses on interpersonal relationship. Earlier, we noted that people in the same culture tend to construe events similarly. So, to point an example, think about driving a car. We state our lives on being able to anticipate what other drivers on the road will do. We anticipate that they will stop at the red light and move ahead at the green light. It is only when we can predict with some certainty what teachers will do that we can adjust our behaviors to theirs. And while we are adapting to them, they are doing the same to us. And that's for the sociality corollary.